Hi, I'm Laura. This presentation is about our work on identifying not just species, but individual birds by analyzing their songs. My co-author Carol developed all of the deep learning models that are the focus of this presentation, and Sara collected the gray warbler recordings I'll be talking about at the end. We know that birds right across the taxonomic spectrum are capable of recognizing one another as individuals based on their vocalizations. If we could do the same, it would open up a raft of new options for monitoring and behavioral study. To give just one example, here in New Zealand and worldwide, we're increasingly using automated recorders to monitor kiwi and other species. But it's notoriously difficult to translate recordings into estimates of population size, let alone dynamics like territory turnover, immigration, and recruitment. If we could identify individuals, or at least count the number of different individuals that we're capturing in these recordings, we could get much more information out of data we already know how to collect really well. We're using deep learning techniques to try to do just that, starting with great spotted kiwi. Here's a little video of two of our study birds, Touquet and Fern. So that's Touquet and Fern interacting, using some little quiet vocalizations near their nest. But what we're mostly looking at are the loud territorial calls that pairs give, often in a duet. Here's an example of a duet from a different pair in our study area. This duet starts with a female, and then the male will come in towards the second half of the call. There are 4 component goals to the research included in this presentation. First, can we acoustically identify known ID great spotted kiwi in our study population? Second, once we know whether we can identify our known birds, can we detect when a new bird's voice turns up in a recording dataset? Third, can we count the number of individuals contributing to a pool of recordings, even if none of them were part of the training dataset? And fourth, can a network trained to identify great spotted kiwi be adapted to identify individuals of other species? Our focal birds for this study are pairs monitored by the Roroa Wildlife Trust using radio transmitters. The Wildlife Trust carries out this population monitoring alongside pest mammal control and Operation Nest Egg programs. We've been recording these birds for about a year now, but the data used for our initial deep learning work was drawn from a narrower window during the breeding season, when we knew where birds' nesting burrows were. This meant we could select songs captured from locations where we were very unlikely to pick up loud calls from anyone but the known territorial pair. That set of calls were then used to train and test the deep learning networks. I'm not going to try to explain in any detail how convolutional neural networks function. There's plenty of really good videos all over YouTube about how that works. In a nutshell, though, what we are doing is using image recognition. This is the same kind of process that Google uses to find you pictures of bicycles. It's the same kind of process that a photo app uses to detect people's faces. It's the same kind of process that allows you to unlock your phone with your fingerprint. But instead of bicycles or faces or fingerprints, we're applying this process to spectrograms, which are essentially images of sound. Here's an overview of the steps involved from recording to individual ID. We start with our raw recordings. These recordings are then segmented to locate the calls within the raw recordings. This process shuttles calls into separate files and provides each call with a bird ID label. In our case, this label is based on where the call was located. Each individual bird's set of calls is split into 2 groups. Most of the songs will be used to train the network, and we reserve 30% of the calls to test the trained network and measure how accurate it is. The training data then undergoes data augmentation. This may sound a bit weird, but it's an important part of making the analysis more robust. In data augmentation, training calls are mixed with background noise from all of the other recording locations. This forces the network to focus on the calls rather than any quirks in the background noise where the calls were recorded. Now we make our spectrograms for each song, perform some noise reduction, and split the spectrogram into 3 color channels. This is another step that might look kind of strange, but is really useful. In color spectrograms, color relates to the energy or intensity of a sound at any time frequency location in the sound. By splitting the spectrogram into 3 channels, you can separately analyze the loudest components of the call in the blue channel and the moderately loud parts of the call in the green channel. This is actually the bulk of the song. The relatively soft parts of the sound fall into the red channel, and this includes the vast majority of the background noise. These spectrograms are then passed into the network, which again we're treating kind of as a black box here. The job of the network is to derive a combination of spectrogram features that matches songs to singers as accurately as possible. And it does a pretty good job. When we give it the set of validation calls, which are shown here, it attributes those calls to the correct singer about 94% of the time overall. To put this in the context of our field monitoring work, what this means is that for the 10 birds in our training set, we can look at our recordings and say with pretty high certainty who is being picked up by which recorders from month to month. And that's pretty cool. But what happens if a new bird shows up? We don't want the network to try to cram that new bird's songs into an existing box. Instead, we want the network to recognize that it needs a new box or boxes for new singers. And this is a harder problem to solve. Carol has approached the problem by asking the network to work towards 2 different goals at the same time. In addition to asking the network to classify individuals, we also ask it to find a good way of organizing songs into cohesive groups without giving it any feedback on exactly who's who. This should have the effect of pushing the network to home in on features that do a good job of distinguishing among singers generally, rather than focusing on details that might make our specific individuals distinctive from one another. We trained this new network with 10 individuals as before, and then we gave it a dataset of fresh songs. In this visualization, we have new songs from 6 individuals that the network has already seen before in the training set. The network has slightly lower accuracy than before, but remember, we've asked it to do 2 jobs well rather than 1 job perfectly, so that's not surprising. The really cool part is that the new dataset also included songs from 2 entirely new individuals that the network had never seen before, and it correctly figured out that it needed 2 new boxes for these 2 new birds rather than 1 or 3 or 6 new boxes. The accuracy for these new birds is lower than for the previously seen birds, but one of the really powerful things about a network is that it can learn from this experience, so we can expect it to classify these birds with higher accuracy if it encounters them again in the future. So what happens if we give this network a set of songs that only includes new birds? We only have 3 unseen birds left to send into the network from our existing dataset, but once again it correctly identifies that it has 3 new birds, and it does a pretty good job of matching up songs and singers. So it looks very much like we can accurately identify known ID birds, detect new birds, and count at least small numbers of birds in our population just using acoustic recorders. So on to goal 4. Will our network translate successfully to other species? We've done a pilot test using grey warbler songs collected in Christchurch reserves. These birds were in patchy, easily accessible habitats where we could be reasonably confident that we were only getting 1 bird at each spot, despite the birds not being marked. We know each of these is definitely a different bird, but we recognize that we can't determine whether any song differences are because we're looking at different sites, different individuals, or some combination of the 2. So this is really just a starting point to see if the network is adaptable and can handle a very different kind of song. And grey warbler songs are very different from Roroa songs. For one thing, they're structurally much more complex, with a really variable initial introduction section, a middle bit, and then a relatively stable phrase that is repeated a variable number of times. For this initial analysis, we focused on that repeated phrase. We used songs from the 5 individuals for whom we had captured at least 30 different songs, and the repeated phrases for those 5 are shown here. And I'll play the song shown in the upper spectrogram so you can hear what a grey warbler sounds like. So in that recording, you should be able to hear that repeated phrase right along the end of the song really clearly, and that's the part we were focusing on. We pre-processed these songs as we did for the Great Spotted Kiwi and passed them along to the classification network that had been trained on Great Spotted Kiwi calls to kickstart the deep learning process. The network's job was to adjust how it derives spectrogram features to get the best possible result for the new kind of song. And again, it did a pretty good job, reaching an overall accuracy of 82% despite having a very different kind of song to deal with and a much smaller data set. This is really just our initial work with these networks. As is the case with almost any research project, we want to increase our data set. For Great Spotted Kiwi, this includes challenging the network with songs from even more known ID individuals from multiple sites. And for gray warblers, we need not only more individuals, but we would like to use marked individuals so we can have higher confidence in the identities of our singers. We also want to record multiple individuals within several different locations so we can tease apart site and individual differences. For gray warblers, we would also like to explore the use of recurrent convolutional networks. This kind of network would allow us to integrate information from multiple different components of structurally complex songs while still comparing apples with apples within each of those components. Recurrent convolutional networks will in turn make the process applicable to a wider range of species. And finally, we will work on how we can best harness these networks for monitoring and behavioral study. Overall, we think we're off to a pretty good start, and we're looking forward to exploring the new bioacoustic opportunities that open up when you know not just what, but who you're listening to. We have a lot of people to thank who've helped out with this project. In particular, we'd like to thank Ray Beckford and Christy Owens for their help in deploying and managing the acoustic recorders in the Papa Rose. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and feel free to get in contact with us if you have any questions. Thanks!